Hello again, everybody. I think you all know me by now. I don't need to say anything further about myself. I am here just to introduce the next event, and I'll be delighted to hand you over to Brian Kirk, who is going to moderate. We're delighted to welcome Eric Lane, who's travelled over from the UK, from Dedalus UK, and Owen Smith. And we're also doing a big reveal here this afternoon. Some of you may have read the novel Prague 1938 by Dara Kavanagh. And Dara Kavanagh is the pseudonym of a much-loved Irish writer. So his identity is finally about to be revealed here today. I hope you get this, Barrett. This is important for your newspaper. So I established a relationship with Dara while he was writing Prague 1938, and I've always admired his writing. I'd say I developed such a good rapport with him that David became incredibly jealous. I just really got on with this guy. I believe he's standing back there and he's about to come out. So Dara, the big reveal. Ladies and gentlemen, Dara Kavanagh, aka David Butler. And Brian, it's over to you. I do keep forgetting to say that we're making a collection here for Purple House Cancer Support Centre. If anybody would like to throw anything into the bucket after the event, please feel free to do so.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Oh, God, Dara Kavanagh is... it's going to take me a while to get used. Oh, the shock of it all. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone, for coming along. This is an event celebrating 40 years of Dedalus Books in the UK, and we're really delighted to have Eric Lane here with us, who's a founder and publisher with Dedalus Books. Just a little bit about Eric first. He obviously the press is named after Stephen Dedalus from Portrait of the Artist of the Young Man by Joyce, and the press was founded in 1983 by Eric. And Eric says that Dedalus has invented its own distinctive genre, which we term distorted reality, where the bizarre, the unusual, the grotesque and the surreal meld in a kind of intellectual fiction which is very European. A recent addition to this exciting project are three Irish authors, Owen Smith, who we have here in the middle, Dara Kavanagh, aka David Butler, who we have at the end, and also Brian Keogh, whose novel Lefanu's Angel was published by Dedalus Books as well. Now, unfortunately, we can't have Brian with us, but today. So David is going to read just a short extract from Lefanu's Angel, just to start us off, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to read a short extract from Lefanu's Angel, literally the start of it. I'm sure you all know there's a very long, solid tradition of the supernatural in Irish writing, going all the way back, Maturin, Melmoth the Wanderer, through Bram Stoker. And Sheridan Le Fanu, of course, was a big part of that in the 19th century, Uncle Silas, books like that. So that's really where the title of this comes from, the hero of it, Kieran Sheridan Le Fanu, just to give you an idea of what the book might be about. But I'm just going to read the opening of it, De Profundis. I came to consciousness, or so I thought, in an abyss of nothingness, a world of black silence, bottomless, eternal. I had no corporeal existence, only a blank consciousness with no memory of who I was or how I got here. It occurred to me that I was in a singularly vivid nightmare. I was locked into it and struggled in vain to pull myself awake. Then the truth hit me. This was no nightmare. I was dead, in some kind of temporary state, a fade out from life to oblivion. The belief took root and blossomed, pricking and swirling in my consciousness. I knew that some medical experts believe that death wasn't always the complete end of things. And even when body and brain shut down, some form of consciousness may remain for a time. Is this what it was? The final dying of cells in my body and synapses in my brain? How long before utter oblivion? I remained in a state of terror and desolation as timeless time passed, until, in the farthest distance of the void, I thought I detected an infinitesimal glint of light, a pinprick in the fabric of my non-universe. Gently, unhurriedly, the light came nearer, expanding now, brighter, brilliant, and intense. Its penetrating luminosity banished the void, a blazing, dancing radiance of a whiteness beyond imagining. Abruptly the light was gone, and all was black void again. Then I jolted awake into a twilight existence, neither asleep nor fully awake, devoid of thought and emotion, hollowed out. I lay gagged and trussed in what appeared to be a four-poster bed under a canopy of night sky, with stars flickering through slow passing clouds. I tried to find an element of my identity and found a blank canvas, like one newly born, awaiting the imprint of experience. And if you want to know any more, folks, Brian's book is available to buy afterwards. And I promise you it's not another pseudonym, okay? Okay, thanks, Brian.
Thanks, David. I just want to start just by talking to Eric for a little bit just about Dedalus books and where they started and why they started. So maybe you might just give us a little bit of background. It's 40 years now this year, so...
Dedalus really started by accident. Like a lot of would-be authors, I attended a novel writing class, and I was seriously impressed with what was being read. And I expected members of the class to disappear and get their books published, but everyone was rejected, which seemed very odd to me. And I thought I could do better than that. Publishing was a commercial activity, and I would publish these unpublishable books. And after that, we would start doing translations of unknown European authors. What I didn't realise, these were the two hardest things to do in publishing, first novels and obscure foreign authors. And in the 1980s, nearly any European novelist was obscure in the UK. Anyway, we started with great hope. I managed to get some support. My biggest supporter was my wife. And together, we found £6,500 from our mortgage and another £3,500 from four others. So we had £10,000. We published the three first novels. We had a lot of startup publicity, and we lost most of it with a NGA strike. We were not your standard publishers. I did a tour of the country doing local radio, and then I repped the bookshops. And we got the books in the bookshops in a very big way. We were everywhere, especially in central London, most of the big city centres. W.H. Smith took all of our books. I went to see the man there, and he said, "What makes you different?" And I thought, what makes us different? We use reader criteria. And he looked at me, and he said, "What's reader criteria?" He said, "We don't care about what the market says. We care about what the reader says. And we know that readers want to read our books." He smiled and he took all of our books. So this tiny company had national distribution through W.H. Smith. What I didn't realise, that getting the books into the bookshops was the easy part. Getting people to go to the bookshops and buy them was the difficult part. And I used to go around the bookshops and I would count our copies of our books. And they were always the same. The last time I counted the copies of our books. And it was like a motto, a watched book doesn't sell. And this went on for weeks. Occasionally, I would find one who disappeared. I'd get very happy, but it'd been mislaid somewhere else. And life was difficult, and we became very much admired by the book trade, and they gave us the nickname the Dead Lost Publishing Company. And I remember, and it was a big shock, waiting to go and speak to some buyer who said, oh, it's a rep from Dedalus. And I thought, God, this is terrible. And so we were the Dedalus Publishing Company going nowhere. Interestingly enough, at the time, The Guardian had a Saturday's People in the big pages. And one week, the guy there was let down by his PR company, and he gave me a third of a page, which is more than the whole page of today's, in The Guardian on Saturday as the publisher of the Dedalus Publishing Company. Bizarrely, this publishing company where each new book was going to be our last, in 1985, The Arabian Nightmare, which we've sold about 300 copies of, which had really good publicity eventually. We kept having relaunches because no one took any notice of the one before. And we did one of the authors was an undertaker. So we did The Rebirth of Fiction. We had a friend of ours who was going to jump out of his coffin on the steps of Time Out as The Rebirth of Fiction. But just before we were doing it, she said she suffered from claustrophobia and wouldn't do it. So we had to hire a model who demanded double because she had to get out of a coffin. So we paid £100. And we had the coffin free of charge. It didn't come in a hearse, but a van. And we walked it down to the steps of Time Out and opened it. Out popped this model. And we had the local television there, and it gave us our first reviews in Time Out, City Limits. Then we got The Guardian, The Times, and we seemed to be going somewhere. And Penguin took an interest in the Arabian Nightmare and offered us £2,000. And eventually we managed to get them up to £21,000. So in 1985, we actually received £21,000 in a cheque from Penguin, and that got in the bookseller, and lots of small publishers sort of pinned it to their wall as something that they wanted to do. So we did everything wrong, and something went right, and I really would not have thought that 40 years later we would still be here. And the only advice I have for publishers is, first of all, survive your errors, because there are going to be lots of them. Two, have some energy and believe in what you're doing and listen to whatever advice that you get. But in the end, whatever mistakes you make sure that they're your mistakes, because other mistakes by other people are incredibly painful. And it's like when you choose a book, you really have to believe in the author. And when people used to ring up and sort of get very stroppy about not taking their book, and I say, if you believe in this book, you spend your money on it and lose your money. I don't believe in your book, and I'm not spending my money on your book. So that's my philosophy. In the end, when we publish a book, it sells no copies, so what? This is a great book. It's just a tremendous disaster for the reading public. They haven't realised it's a great book. The books we tend to publish have a European feel to it. And this is why we took Owen's book. Owen was the first book by an Irish author we published, which was 2018, which was very unusual because we were a company named after James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus. And we were actually founded as a limited company on the 16th of June 1983, which is Bloomsday. So we have all these Irish links, and I was quite obsessed with James Joyce and how wonderful he was. But we had to wait to 2018 to get our first Irish author. But it's like the buses in London. One comes and they all keep coming along. So we now have 3 Irish authors. Because of that, we want to develop an Irish list. With Brexit, it's a bad time for Europe and UK relationships. And I think it's very good as a pro-European publisher to publish books from Ireland, because you're our nearest neighbour, we share a language some of the time, and you are in the EU. And in the end, the UK and the EU have to become friends again. We don't have to be in the same club, but we at least have to talk to each other in a civilised fashion. And I think by publishing Irish authors, we're making a small step along that direction.
Thanks very much, Eric. You mentioned a couple of things I was going to ask you about there. One of them is Brexit, but even aside from Brexit being a difficulty, as it must be, what about other kind of difficulties? You mentioned at the outset putting your own money in, and did you manage to get funding from other sources, Arts Council funding or things like that over the years?
Yeah, money's always been a problem for small publishers. As I said, in the early days, every book was going to be the last book. And in 1990, it got increasingly difficult for me having a publishing company where I not only earned no money, I actually was financially supporting. It was such a struggle. So we tried to increase production, increase turnover, and in the end we just got a lot of big debts. And that was the year we first got a grant from the Arts Council, which actually paid our interest on our overdraft. And we took the next 10 years to actually get rid of our overdraft. And so when I say survive your errors, that's an example of one of my errors. We did get money from the Arts Council. It was never a sort of great amount. And we actually lost our Arts Council money in the 1990s because our grant wasn't high enough. They had the cut-off figure. We're underneath the cut-off figure, and they stopped our grant. And as someone who trained as a lawyer, I knew that they hadn't done it properly, that they can have any policy they want, but they had to make sure that there wasn't an exception to this policy. So I sent them a press release, a small publisher sues the Arts Council. And the chief executive of the Cambridge office rang me up, cried on the phone, and said, please don't publish this press release. And I was sent to the London head office to her, I didn't know that, her almost patron. They grew up in the same area anyway. So I kept saying, you know you'd lose if we took you to court. And he wouldn't answer that because obviously he's taken legal advice. So what they did, he said, you get translation grants. They added some on and we were over the threshold. So we didn't lose our funding. But when you annoy somebody in a bureaucracy, there's always payback time. So that really started a sort of 10-year civil war with the Arts Council. And they signed us up to have a review of our progress. And we had 4 people, 2 from the Arts Council, 2 from outside. And much to my surprise, at the end of it, they decided that we should get much bigger funding, have a proper office, have more staff, and be something major for them. 3 months later, we were invited in to see the official report, and it then said we were going to lose our funding and it's goodbye. And we were shell-shocked at this. And we kept asking them, because it was being recorded. It's like here, not on YouTube, but it was recorded on a floppy disk. And we kept asking to see the floppy disk. And they wouldn't. They kept sending us so-called printouts. And the Freedom of Information Act was about to come in, and we made a request to have the floppy disk. And they wouldn't send us the floppy disk, because what the floppy disk would show, it has been edited. So rather than send us a floppy disk, we were reinstated. So that's the second time. The third time is that there was a mass cull of publishers, of arts companies, theatre companies, which caused a huge scandal because they were given a lot of money by the Labour government and they dropped all these organisations. And the some of these theatre companies in the past had famous people. So all the knights came to battle, the acting knights for their favourite theatre company. And we really missed out. We got on the queue I was the first person to say we're going to sue the Arts Council because they haven't followed their disinvestment guidance. And so whenever they mention people in the Arts Council, we always got to mention. And when Sir Christopher Frayling, who was the chairman of the Arts Council, was interviewed just before their sort of final decisions, and he gave a list of people who were going to be spared, and we were on that list. So we thought we were okay. And then when it happened the week after, we weren't on that list. So we lost our funding. We were saved by Routledge funding us instead of the Arts Council for 2 years. And in that time, we went through the Arts Council complaint scheme, which is total farce and so fixed, and it's pretty disgusting. And we managed to get a lawyer, one of the top public law companies in the country, to sue the people who did the final revision of our funding. But they weren't a public body, so we had to sue the Arts Council, and we were out of time. And we sued the Arts Council outside of the, in those days it was 2 years. We sued them, and the Arts Council actually laughed when we said we were suing them because we were out of time. And to cut a long story short, the judge actually held that we were treated badly by the Arts Council in every turn. We weren't properly considered, and as we went through the Arts Council complaints system, which took us 2 years, and they did it as slowly as possible so we'd be out of time, that it was in the public interest that our case was heard. So we actually won, and then we were reassessed and we were put in again. So we've been funded by the Arts Council since then, always the minimum amount, though the minimum amount keeps going up, so we don't complain. In October, this month, we hear what happens with our current application. As I say, that sort of with the Arts Council, one doesn't know. Is it payback time yet again, or do they know there are a lot of skeletons hidden in the Arts Council Dedalus cupboard, and some might come out? So we live in hope that they will give us the minimum amount of funding.
Thanks very much, Eric. That sounds completely fraught. I don't know how you're expected to do business in that kind of climate, really. We'll leave it there for the moment. We'll come back to Eric later on. I'd like to introduce just Eoghan to read maybe first. I'll just tell you about Eoghan. Eoghan Smith is the author of the novels A Provincial Death, 2022, and The Failing Heart in 2018. He's contributed to a variety of publications and journals, including the Irish Times, Literary Review, Books Ireland, and the Dublin Review of Books. His other books include the co-edited collection Imagining Irish Suburbia and Literature, 2018, and the monograph John Banville, Art and Authenticity, in 2014. So maybe, Eoghan, you'll read a little bit from A Provincial Death for us.
Thanks, Brian. I just say thanks to Tanya for organising the event, and for also congratulations on the Bray Literary Festival, which has been, I know this is your last year, so just congratulations on the last few years, and what a contribution you've made to the arts in Ireland, so well done. And thank David as well for all his support too. This book is about, for those of you who haven't read it, it's about a man who gets washed up on a rock in the Irish Sea. And essentially it's the story of him clinging onto that rock, and the choice he faces is whether or not he should stay clinging to the rock or whether he should let go. And the course of the action takes place over a day. When the book opens, he is found on the rock, and that's where we sort of join the action at the start. There is a a kind of I suppose, an important plot line in it, in which he's been working as an academic in a small provincial university or college, and he's been an assistant to a woman who's been investigating the moon, and this woman has become convinced, this professor, convinced that the moon is about to crash into the earth, sort of obliterating everything. So this is kind of the I feel like the premise of the novel, and as he is clinging onto the rock, he's sort of turning over in his mind this belief that this woman has. It's not, as I say, the moon is not necessarily going to crash into the earth in the novel, it's just something that she believes. So the novel is really about, I suppose it's about a sense of catastrophe and how you can endure an overwhelming sense that catastrophe is about to befall us. And as I was writing the novel, I was thinking about things like climate disaster, for instance, but also I was writing it during COVID too, and thinking about various different types of disasters that the human race has to endure. And of course, now there's this threat of nuclear war as well. So I think the book has a sort of timely feel to it, if I can say that myself. So I wasn't sure which bit to read, but I might read this passage towards the end of the novel. And he's getting close to nighttime, and he's sort of mulling over how things have been for him. In the sea, no matter how hot the day has been, it's always cold at night. The night breeze blows on and the dark waves never cease. Like you, these natural forces have no true history. Their pasts have no reality. Like you, they've been set to whirl about as if they've lost everything, even though they never truly had anything. For you cannot be of the world and possess it at the same time. And now you also know what you suspected all along, that it's also the case that in the sea at night there's no place to hide and there's no place to shelter. And yet, all around you is the world, this elemental place made of air, water, and rock. This is your home now. This has always been your home. You were thrown into no other. You had no choice. You have, in your own way, tried to understand the creatures you've shared it with, if only for a while, tried to recognize its place in the cosmological scheme, though you know that you've understood nothing of it. Not really. Nonetheless, you have in your own way tried to love it, tried to feel its truth. You may, in your own way, be soothed by that. I'll just let that bite go. It's not important to me if you are or if you're not. That's all right. Close your eyes now. There's no need to look at the ocean any longer. The gulls have gone to their nests. The sleeping fish are invisible to you in the dark water. Don't think about what you've lost. Don't think about who you've lost. Don't think about what is gone, what has happened. Don't look up at the moon. You can't follow her. Don't pray for tomorrow's sun to warm your body. It will only set your head aflame again. Close your eyes, lash by lash, rod by rod, cone by cone, wave by wave. There's no more water, and there's no more sun. Escape into sleep, escape one night, one gloaming, one night. Close your eyes and escape one night. You've been on the great earth, spinning furiously in space, and you did not fall off. Against everything, you climbed your way to the top of the rock. Close your eyes. I can tell you that Saturn and Jupiter have ascended. It's enough to know that. And listen. If you close your eyes and open your ears, you'll hear in the tiny vibrations of the wind the song of the sea. And when for the last time you stretch out your hand and reach up your fingers, you'll feel blindly for the sky, and you will unpin the stars.
Thanks very much, Eoghan. I think that gives you hopefully a flavour of what the novel is like. It's not your average novel, and you can see why Eric was interested in Eoghan's novel when he got his hands on it. It has a lot of interesting elements to it, and just that section you read, it's kind of in the second person addressing the character, speaking to it. The novel is full of kind of changes of perspective. At one stage, there's the point of view of a gull looking down on him, and then a sprat beside him on the rock. And then at one stage, I just marked it here in it, we get a change of perspective again, where this other authorial voice comes in and says, we note that there have been 2 mentions of his dead mother already. And this begins a new section, and it's really surprising for the reader when you come across it. Maybe could you just talk to us a little bit about perspective and the voices that are talking around this character Smith? By the way, Smith with a Y, which not Smith with an I, so it's definitely not Eoghan, the main character in this.
Yeah, well, the Smith with a Y business is my family name is Smith, but my mother's name was also Smith, but she was a Smith with a Y. So it was kind of a joke for me. I don't know if it's a funny joke, but it made me laugh when I thought of it at the start. But I guess in a way that's a sort of a way into thinking about it, that there is a kind of a splintering of the voice in the book as well. And some of it is, you know, I suppose some of it, there's an autobiographical element in it. There's pieces of auto-fiction in it too. I mean, I've never been stranded on a rock in the Irish Sea, but I think that when I started to write it, I knew I didn't want to write it in the first person, although there is a section where it goes into the first person. And I knew that if I wrote it in the third person, that it would feel false in some way. I knew that there had to be this other voice that would sort of narrate over the narrator, if you like. So I was thinking really that one of the core elements in the novel is that there's a lack of certainty about what is happening and what is going to happen. Now, I don't mean that the novel is ambiguous. I just mean that for the character, there's a sense of kind of disorientation, of confusion, of being discombobulated in some way. And therefore, the voice had to keep changing. But I also wanted to have an authorial voice which was almost godlike in a sense, which had this kind of much larger perspective on what was happening. And I also knew that that narrator also had to be limited in some key way as well. That it couldn't be like some 19th century British realist kind of George Eliot type narrator who would know everything and tell you what's going on. That the narrator you're talking about who says, we note that there have been 2 mentions, that narrator also had to have a kind of limitation to their perspective as well, so that we didn't feel confident in what they were saying. In other words, that narrator is almost like a character in the book. And then there's the author who's looking at them. So I think the other reason was that because it was set in water, I liked the idea of it shifting around like waves, and sort of that there's a bobbing about and a tossing about, and it's, you know, that is consistent, I suppose, with the narrative voice. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see exactly what you're saying, Eoghan. I mean, that second narrator, if you like, is another layer, but it's an imperfect narration as well, but it brings you a little bit closer to the truth. But somehow you manage as well to deliver, despite it, like it's obviously, you can see shades of Beckett, like even in the section that Eoghan read, in the repetitions particularly, in that section. And there are elements of that in the narration as well, and the commentary, the ongoing commentary that's going on the action as it's being told. But there's moments in it of real lyrical beauty as well, which seem to be strange to sit beside. There's one section I marked here where you get a bit of backstory about Smith. And he talks, and suddenly it's out of nowhere again, because that's the nature of the way the story is told, that it arrives as an image without any fanfare, and it's just like no brothers, no sisters, an only child, bubby nose, copper crown, dungarees and stripy top, sitting in the back seat of a wine-red car on a jaunt around the furthest peninsulas of the southwest coast. Backs of his parents' head, private laughter, window roll, bursts of ragwort, pungency of wild garlic, windrush on fingers, calls of seabirds, glow of midsummer evening, first exhilarating sight of the Atlantic. And that's just dropped into the narrative. Consciously, were you trying to create kind of an effect of alternative kind of styles within the novel?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are moments where he's remembering sort of his childhood, where he sort of falls into that lyrical mode. As we do when we're remembering, we sort of get romantic about things. So in a way that the voice that sort of dips into that lyricism is, I wouldn't say it's an artificial tone, but it's definitely, I feel like there's an hint of nostalgia about it. And I think for Smith, the narrator, he sort of filters his world through nature. You know, he sees it everywhere. He's conscious of it all the time. But I think also, Brian, I just wanted the book to be really beautiful as well, because the novel deals with very heavy themes. Sort of planetary catastrophe and impending death and sort of I felt that if it just would be too gloomy and it would be too hard to read it if there wasn't something for the reader to really I wanted it to be artistic, I suppose, as well, and to see that in moments of catastrophe there is beauty there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and I think we'll just park that. There's some interesting ideas there, but maybe we'll just for the moment, David, will you read us a section from? I suppose do I really need to introduce David Butler, aka Dara Kavanagh? We all know David. His novel City of Dis is well known. His current book of short stories, Fugitives. His poetry. What's the name of the poetry collection again? Liffey Sequence, and they're only the recent ones. There's a lot more besides. So David, maybe you might read a bit from Prague, 1938.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd been to Prague 5 times in total at this stage, going all the way back to 1990 was the first time, just after the wall had come down, 92, 99, 2005, and then most recently in 2017. I'm fascinated by the city. And what I thought was going to be a short story when I came back just grew at the rate of 2,000 words a day over the space of 6 weeks. It's the shortest time I've ever spent writing the first draft of a novel. It came very easily, the story itself. It's the story of an adolescent, Guido Hayek, and his infatuation, first of all, with a girl he has seen who's a couple of years older than him. He's about 14, she's about 17, who he follows around. But it's really a love story that goes wrong between himself and his father. He'd been homeschooled, and he gets very disillusioned with his father when he finds out things about him. And also there's a half-sister, so it plays along with all those things. It was written then, it was published last year, and it's one of those very fortuitous things, I suppose, that the premise of the book is a small country which is surrounded by a bigger, expanding country run by a dictator who uses the pretext of a minority within that country to swallow it. Which, when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking of anything, but, its time seems to have come with what's happening at the moment in Ukraine. So I'll read 2 short enough pieces. One, just to give an idea of Guido and his father. His father runs an art gallery as they're walking through Prague. And then a second one when he's following this Jewish girl that he's become obsessed with, Leah Meisel. So it came about that every Tuesday and Thursday he'd take me to the U Czerneos Lunche Gallery, the Black Sun, on Karlova Street. It'll be a good apprenticeship for the boy, he announced at the dinner table, and so it was. There was so much to learn, not merely developing an eye for arts trends and the idea of the prices a particular artist might fetch, but framing, restoring, touching up, talking to customers, engaging what it was that they most wanted to hear, was a skill in itself, one at which Papa excelled. Only rarely did a customer meet the asking price. The asking price was no more than an opening gambit in a game of bargaining and haggling that might take an hour or more, during which biscuits and a samovar of tea, or even a bottle of absinthe, were produced. Guido, go and see if the little green fairy is home. he'd say at such times. And then there were the ledgers with their double entry accounts and balance sheets that had to come out identically when you totted up income against expenditure. Mostly I was an errand boy. This delighted me. I loved Prague, that fairy tale city. Papa placed an injunction on informing Maman of this aspect of my apprenticeship. Maman would not have approved. He gave me an allowance to cover these days, not quite a wage, but given how little I spent beyond old stamps or an odd second-hand book, it was sufficient for me to begin to amass a nest egg in an old biscuit tin I kept hidden at the back of my wardrobe. You should never be without a little something put aside, he'd say, unpeeling a few 20 Karuna notes. Fate has this nasty habit of springing surprises on us out of the bluest of skies. Because he had the only set of keys and had to let in the cleaning woman, Dara, who came 3 mornings a week, and Jan, who'd lost part of his arm in the war and worked half days, we had to rise before dawn. We'd set off, having had nothing but a glass of water and maybe an old crust. Later, I'd be sent out to the corner cafe for hot bread rolls and coffee, which I'd carry back in a pewter flask, but never before 10 o'clock when the gallery opened its doors to the public. I loved the walk down Mosteka and over the Karlov Bridge, before the city had woken up, with the mist low over the river and the roofs and cobbles glinting as though they were newly washed. The gallery was always cold to begin with, though by the time we opened up to the public at 10, it had warmed through our activity. I loved the very smells of the place, with the cold air and our hunger pangs made more distant, the heady volatility of turpentine and white spirits, the rich savour of linseed oil, the burnt tang of sandalwood and beech shavings from Jan's lathe. It was as well we set off so early. Papa could never pass an acquaintance without exchanging pleasantries, gossip, or the latest off-colour anecdote. Always remember, Guy, our business is people. I think his philosophy went beyond the gallery. Papa was a social animal to the roots of his being. He had a sonorous voice that came from the diaphragm, and he loved nothing better than to exercise it. He was the king of banter, of flirtation. At any other time but 7 in the morning, it might have taken him 30 minutes to cross that bridge. As it was, we were often 15 or even 30 minutes late to open the shop for Jan, who scowled and muttered, and Daria, who couldn't have cared less. So that's himself and his father in the heyday at the start, before things begin to go a bit askew. And here he is, as I said, he's become obsessed with this Jewish girl, Leah Meisel, whose grandfather, who's raised her, has a gallery as well. And he's taken to following her. It so happened that on the very morning of that meeting, a breezy Saturday, I was walking by the Eoghan Park on the Malastrana side when I caught sight of her mass of dark hair. She was seated just inside an entrance. I ducked back at once, took up a position behind a tree. She appeared to be reading, though it was too far to see what alphabet the book was written in. There was a basket beside her, open, with what looked like dirty linen inside it. Now, though I hadn't paid it any notice, that entrance was directly across from Laszlo's jewellers. I'd been there for no more than a couple of minutes when, from the door of the jewellers, there erupted a commotion of street kids scattering in different directions. One sped past me and on through Eoghan Park. They were followed almost at once by Laszlo himself in apron and green visor, who chased another in the direction of Karlov Bridge, yelling, "Stop, thief!" Several seconds later, another figure emerged from the shop, a man in fedora and overcoat. He made at once for the park, hurried past where the girl was seated, and as he passed, I saw him drop something small into her basket of linen. He then set off abruptly in pursuit of the street kid who'd sped past me, he too calling, "Stop, thief!" It was all done in the blink of an eye. Slowly, almost leisurely, the girl rose. I must have stepped out from the tree in all the excitement, because she was looking straight at me. She lifted her basket and looked about as though considering which way to go. Then she began to make straight for me. I saw that she moved her right leg with a restricted motion, as though there was a stone in the shoe. My instinct was to bolt, but something held me. Apprehension? Fear? The closer she came, the more paralysed I was. At last she stood before me, so close that there was nothing else in my field of vision. You were watching me. Why? My limbs were as though paralysed, my thoughts too. I opened and closed my mouth, swallowed dryness. How she must despise the obscenity of my huge Adam's apple, bobbing up and down like a float on a fishing line. Involuntarily, my eyes drifted down towards a basket of linen. I've seen you before, she said. When I didn't reply, her hand swooped out of nowhere and smashed across my face. The smart was appalling, shortening my breath and blinding my eyes with hot water. I turned my face from her. To anyone in the vicinity, it must have appeared a domestic squabble. I don't like to be watched, she hissed. Then, unhurrying, though Laszlo was by this time pacing back and forth in front of his shop like an agitated hen, she raised her basket and proceeded through the park in the direction of the river. There we go.
Thanks very much, David. That gave us a great flavour, I think, of the novel and of Prague as well. And I'm amazed that you're telling us you wrote that really quickly. When I read the novel, I was really taken by not just the story, which is a great story, and the parallel story of the young boy Guido and his kind of confusion, and the confusion that's going on publicly as well with the onset of World War II. And all the changes that are happening. But the level of detail, I thought, in the novel was incredible, and it was so well carried off. So tell us about the research you did do, or was it all in your brain from your visits to Prague?
Well, as I said, the 5th time I was in Prague was in 2017. And myself and Tanya, we were staying, it was for New Year, it was winter, and we were staying on the Malastrana side, and we'd walk exactly the route these guys walk every day to go into the old city. And we did the walking tour, and it was my 3rd time doing the walking tour over the years, and it takes you to the old Jewish area. And it's an incredibly walkable city, and it's an incredibly resonant place. And as I said, even when I was there, I was just imagining this short story. This guy who would walk across with his father and who would become obsessed with this girl who happened to be Jewish. Full stop. And then I just had this idea, and then he discovers one day following her that she's part of a gang of petty thieves. Okay, great. It'll be a long, short story. But, research-wise, there were certain things I obviously had to research, like how much was a koruna worth in those days? How much was the lira worth because they go to Italy? How much would that translate into dollars? What was the actual political situation in 1938 in terms of the pro-German parties, the rise of fascism, the Hayek himself, or not Hayek, I can't remember his name, the premier of the Czech Republic, and then angles like the Polish government was very, very right-wing, and it wanted a piece of the Czech Republic. It was really happy it was being carved up. All these angles became the background, but they also are part of the foreground. So the first draft wrote itself in 6 weeks. The second draft and the third draft, before I sent it over to Eric, would have been, let's tighten up this, let's make sure it makes sense, let's sure I'm getting the time scale right. There was also the art element. The art element was a huge part of it. So much so that my working title for it had been Degenerate, because the father had gone to the Nazi exhibition of degenerate art in 1938 in Munich, and to a certain extent, his half-sister is half Jewish. He himself has a very bad heart. There's a homosexual that's beaten up and killed in a park. They're all degenerate to a certain extent. So that was my working title. But the whole idea of degenerate art, my favourite movement of art has always been expressionism, particularly German expressionism. I love it, so that was always there as part of the background, hence the gallery, I suppose.
Just to go back to the story itself, the story is quite complex as well. I know you're saying it started out as a short story and it was just going to be this, a guy with his father, and then a girl, and then suddenly there's more to it. But in terms of how you built up the story and how you tell the story, like it's the sense of realism is really, it's like I say, you evoke the city really well, but you evoke the individual characters. You have Klaus, the stepbrother, who's a neo-Nazi or whatever, and then there's Katya that you mentioned, the sister, and then there's the Jesuit priest. He was a really interesting character to have, along with the mother, I think, is another really interesting character. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about how those characters came to play a part in it.
Sure. Maybe it comes from the fact that I do amateur drama, but something that's always been put into my head: when you're playing anyone on stage, you have to believe in them. You have to believe in their point of view. So don't ever play a villain as a villain, because that's just caricature. Play it as if you are right. If you're Hitler, the world is better if I can impose this order on it. You have to believe that, and that has always entered into my writing. I tried to, enter the headspace of any character. So I was trying to get that complexity. So, for example, Father Kaufmann, he is a Sudeten German. That is a valid point of view. Klaus is actually a Czech nationalist, but he may as well be a fascist, even though he eventually joins the resistance and is hunted down, etc., etc. So I wanted to get that complexity into it, there's all these complex identities. And to begin with, as I said, it was going to be about how a 14-year-old becomes totally disillusioned by his father. Without giving too much of the plot away, his father tries to pull a fast, dirty trick on the Jewish girl's grandfather, because he has to leave the country and he's not allowed to take his art collection with him. So he's going to, cheat him, and he's disillusioned. But then when I was playing around with the idea of his half-sister Katya, I suddenly thought, well, what if he also ends up in a situation of betrayal? And that's where the complexity came. So it's a learning curve for him, but it's a very disillusioning one. It's written from the perspective of 1942. So it's just really 4 years after this. And he's realised what he's done and who he's let down. So, yeah, it kind of grew in complexity every time I added 2,000 words.
I can see it in the finished article. I think it's so rich in detail. That's the way I put it, I think. And it's very satisfying read, for all the more so because of that detail. From both of your point of view, Eoghan and David, when I was reading both your novels, reading your novel, Eoghan, I thought of Beckett, I did straight away, but I also thought of other writers as well. I thought of Calvino, I thought of, I suppose in my 20s I would have read a lot of Sartre's novels, of Camus and that stuff like that, where there's this kind of, they're novels of ideas, where there's a kind of a philosophical quest going on, as well as a narrative being told. And David, in your novel, when I was reading it, it felt like reading a Hans Fallada novel to me, it's good, or a Joseph Roth even. There's one page, I think, where I think Father Kavanagh mentioned Stefan Zweig, and in the next, I think in the next paragraph, somebody mentions the Radetzky March. And I thought he's having a laugh here, but no. But it does stand up in that group. Maybe just talk about your influences, if I can, a bit. It's a very record question.
Yeah, one of the highest compliments I was paid was when I was being reviewed by the Historical Novel Society, and she said it read like a lost manuscript of Stefan Zweig, which is absolutely brilliant, Yeah, and in fact, the only thing that has always been, why didn't I do that, is that in 1942, if I remember right, at the start of 1942, Stefan Zweig and his wife, they'd fled the country and they were living in Brazil. They both committed suicide because they couldn't take what was happening. And it would have been just a lovely note to bring into the final chapter that he had discovered that. But they're hugely, you were talking about the research. It's that idea that the way they say that the Quran never once mentions camel. So if you need to mention camel, you're being deliberately this or deliberately that. What I was doing was I was reading all these novels that were literally written in the 20s and 30s rather than about them, to see how they talked about things. And yeah, Radesi Marx, Stefan Zweig, Hans Fallada, as you say, all of those. I was reading those compulsively. How do they refer to things? How do they talk about things? What don't they spell out? You know what I mean?
There's a whole atmosphere, there's a richness, probably for us looking back and reading them now, there's a richness to those books now. Not just because of quality of writing, but because of the time as well, the place.
And then there's also elements in it, like of Oliver Twist, for example, like, that's there as well,
Yeah. What was the question again? Sorry. Yeah. I mean, Beckett is someone I've read a lot, but I probably the thing for me was that I've always been interested in European literature as well. Irish literature is European literature. We shouldn't make that sort of false distinction. But let's say the Irish writing is the dominant strain in Irish writing is realism, and there's something about realism which I love, but I've never been able to write in a realist way, in an overtly realist way, and so I've always been more drawn to writers who are, I suppose you could call experimental in some ways. I mean, in my own work as a student was largely on John Banville, who I think really blazed the trail in Ireland, and continues to still do so, in terms of what he did with form in particular, also how he used language. But one of the most formative things for me was when I was a student in UCD was I took philosophy as an undergraduate along with English, and it went into my head and it never left. There was one course in existentialism which I took, and of course when you're 20 and a bit angsty, I mean, it's probably the best. This thing spoke to me like nothing else ever had before, and I read Sartre obsessively, Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, of course. Everybody reads Nietzsche. So that I think has always remained an influence. But lately I've been reading, I think Dasa Derndich is probably doing did before she died, some of the most interesting work in European fiction. And what I loved about her work when I came to her a couple of years ago, I bought everything that was published by her, was her way of slipping in between documentary and fiction in the space of a couple of pages. And I thought that I've never really read anything like this before. So I was interested in that, and some of that found its way in there. But I guess those are the kind of writers and thinkers, yeah. Novels of ideas, really, have always interested me, yeah. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Time is passing a little bit, so maybe we'll just come around, Eric, to you again. The one thing I wanted to ask you about was, I can see, hopefully people can see the flavour, the kind of novels that you're publishing here today. And I just wondered about, you mentioned about distribution, how you did well to get the books into shops in the UK and that. But I just wondered in terms of reviews and things like that, how easy is it to get reviews of your books for books like these, which have a kind of a different flavour?
There is a fundamental change in the last 5 years growing. Everyone knows the print media is declining. Less people read newspapers, even less read book reviews. So there's less places in print media to get book reviews, and they have less effect. You can have some really good reviews, and you wouldn't know. I always used to say, good review in the Independent, you would never notice because it might sell one book. A good review in The Guardian, you might sell 300 plus books, even thousands, So getting reviews is partly an issue, but it's the effect of those reviews. Social media, on the whole, doesn't sell books. And for us, on the whole, most of our books have steadily sold less copies. Whatever we did at one stage, you sell 300 copies, and that's a failure. Today, 300 copies is very respectable. And that's a big change. But even as things have got more difficult, you always have the odd accident. I brought a few copies along. We did a book called New Finished Grammar, which I generally thought would sell 300 copies, and we've sold 30,000 copies. Obviously, if you have a few more accidents like that, life would be very sweet, but they don't come along too often. So there is a problem in publishing, getting book reviews that sell books, but also with Amazon's power and online, whereas most of our books will be everywhere, bit by bit, our coverage in bookshops has shrunk. And I think that is the case for most independent publishers. And also when you go into a bookshop, your time there isn't long. Obviously the saving grace is you can buy anything you want online, but as in terms of a physical presence in bookshops, for us it's declining. There are certain shops, for instance Blackwell's in Oxford, where you would go and you see a lot of our books. But those kind of what I call shop window bookshops are getting less for independent publishers. It is more complicated. If you take Owen's book, he's really very good, quite sort of ecstatic reviews. But as I say, how many people are reading these ecstatic reviews and how many people are going to buy the books after them? If you asked me when we started, how do you sell a book, I could have told you what I thought. Now I honestly don't know. I'm waiting for my next accident and the next 30,000 copies. But it is got more complicated, more difficult, and we tend to publish books which are unusual, they're different. A lot of them are translations. We like the sort of European feel of books. That draws me to Ireland, for instance. And when we publish a book, we're not looking to publish a book that is like the last book you read. Lots of people have said to me, why don't you publish bestsellers? And I said, well, one, they're not our kind of book, and I listed some books which were surprise bestsellers. But I said, if we published them, they wouldn't have been a bestseller because we wouldn't have the money to have them on display, to do this, to do that. The successes of small literary publishers are accidents because you have nothing to make it a success, even if you get wonderful book reviews. What we have done in the past is managed to sell our books abroad to Europe because those are very European in style. European publishers have tended to buy rights, and that's helped us. That's got more difficult with various economic problems floating around, but I hope that that returns. And I remain optimistic that whatever the problems, there's a future for us and other independent publishers in Ireland and in the UK.
Thanks very much, Eric. And I think we all agree that we do hope there's a future for Dedalus books and for great writing like we've heard today. I want to thank everyone who came along today to witness the guys reading and to hear Eric. And before we go, there are books for sale there as well. So please go up and have a look, and you can buy your copy of a Dedalus book today, €10. So thanks again to Eric, to Eoghan and to David, and I hope you hang on for the next event now. Thanks a lot.